Hi, everyone. I'm John Patterson. I thank you for tuning into our Saturn Roundtable. I'm super excited about this. I wanted to gather 3 astrologers who basically have Saturn in the last 3 signs of the zodiac: Saturn in Capricorn, Saturn in Aquarius, and Saturn in Pisces. I thought it would be a cool way for us to either reflect or anticipate our Saturn returns, as Saturn just finished transiting through Capricorn and will now be moving into Aquarius. And also that these are the last 3 signs of the zodiac. We're all millennials with these placements, and just to share our experiences, share our ideas about Saturn, what Saturn symbolism is, and just explore Saturn, all things Saturn. So again, my name is John Patterson. I've been studying astrology for about 3 years, and I just recently started a practice in September. And up next, we have Kelsey.
Hello, thanks for having me, John and Christa. My name is Kelsey Rose Tortorice. I usually am on the internet as Kelsey Rose or Kelsey Rose Tort. I have Saturn in Capricorn, so just finished up my first return. I've been studying astrology for nearly 6 years and practicing for about 1.5 years. And yeah, we're keeping it brief, so I'll leave it at that for now.
Hi, all. I'm Christa Lei, on the internet as Christa Lei. I have been studying astrology for a pretty long time. I would say like it's, I entered it like most people do, like when they're young and like they sun sign horoscopes and stuff. But I would say I've taken my studies a little more seriously in the past 2 to 3 years. And I've softly launched my practice last fall after a lot of conferences, and I'm happy to be here. So thank you, John, and thank you, Kelsey, too. And I have a Saturn in Aquarius, and it's fun because I have a little support group for that and making my way through it.
Thank you both so much for joining. And I have Saturn in Pisces. I'm sure you've gathered that by now, but I didn't mention. So first, we wanted to talk about a little bit about the general symbolism of Saturn, and basically what is this planet that everyone is so afraid of, and how can we maybe reframe that and sort of have some respect for Saturn instead of getting so afraid. And Saturn is often the planet. Saturn can be associated with restrictions and limitations, and that is true, but Saturn restricts and limits us because it has certain lessons that it wants to teach us, and it wants us to mature and to grow to our fullest potential. And I was actually digging into the Saturn myths a bit today, just to sort of supplement this conversation a little bit. I was thinking about Saturn originally comes from the Greek god Kronos, who something I found really interesting about the Kronos myth was that Cronus's father was Uranus, so this chaos, and then Cronus castrates his father. And I think that that Cronus, that's such an interesting like symbolism for Saturn, because in a way that's kind of what Saturn does to all of us, where it's like, oh, you think you're really like powerful and strong, and in a phallocentric society that the ancient Greeks were in, this castration sort of symbolizes this like taking of power away. And Saturn is kind of like, you're not as strong and invincible as you think you are, which sounds like it can be a bit of a downer, and obviously when you're experiencing it, it is, but ultimately you can walk away from that, I think, with a kind of humility and with a kind of knowledge of your own limitations, and with a wisdom going forward.
Yeah, I often, when I was first learning about astrology, I remember one of the ways that I thought about Saturn a lot was in opposition to Jupiter. And that's, astrology is a study of opposites in many ways. Jupiter and Saturn are not technically polarities the way that we have like sign polarities or house polarities. But it is really interesting to think about it that way, because then you can tune in a little bit more to the why we need Saturn if you're looking at it in opposition to Jupiter. I remember one of the things I first learned that really stuck with me about these 2 planets was that Jupiter can be likened to the inhale and Saturn to the exhale. And if we think about just like this constant inhale, that would not that would not be good. Like we need that exhale, we need that depletion, we need that opposite to expansion. And I like the way you phrased it, John, a lot, just around like, yeah, limitation can suck. Like sometimes I, in readings, will refer to Saturn as the cock block of the zodiac. There are definitely times when Saturn cock blocks us a little bit, but there are also times when Saturn makes clear to us what our limitations are so that we can know them, because we need to know them. And I say this as a very Jupiterian person who's naturally much more comfortable with Jupiter energy than Saturnian energy. But, you know, when you live most of your life in a very Jupiterian way, you come to be grateful for the Saturnian lessons as well, because otherwise you're just overabundant in a not super comfortable way. You're like at the top of that inhale without a chance to exhale, and that is very anxiety inducing.
Sorry, y'all, my pups are here, but no, I really agree with that. I like to kind of put Saturn in the role of daddy, capital D, daddy, because sometimes you just need someone to help you learn how to, I mean, like, I like the restrictions and limitations. There's also kind of a kink component to it at that point. And I really love what you said about being in the cock block of the zodiac, Kelsey, because that's, whew, yes, he is. But yeah, no, I mean, I love the mythological aspects of Saturn and how, I mean, he was also kind of, he literally was, it's hard for me to, hi baby. It's hard for me to kind of explain that, and I'm kind of in brain mush right now, but I just think he was kind of insane. It's like a god, right? He's very, but it was all in kind of this aspect of like, okay, hi buddy, to really cut things. And, you know, we'll talk about, you know, Sect 2 and dignity, but like, he's really a malefic. And then you think about like also with, you know, Saturnalia and like Saturn festival and time, you have to really think about that time component. And we'll also, you know, I think we'll be talking about, you know, Saturn cycles. And I just think that Saturn is, it's not something that we should be afraid of, but I also just, I think we just have to be mindful of Saturn.
Definitely. And I feel like, I mean, what you said about time is so important too, because it's like so much of Saturn's lesson, I think, is the passage of time. And that, you know, that's part of limitations. It's part of like, we're all going to grow old. We're not going to live forever. We're not immortal. But, you know, that truth also kind of sucks to know. It's like, I'm going to die eventually, which is very much like the Saturn. Maybe that's more like a second Saturn return when people are older. But, you know, I think Saturn really does confront us with that we're not invincible. And speaking of Sect, I think that would be a great place to go into next, is talking about Sect and dignity. Christa, if you want to talk more about that.
Sure. So Sect and Essential Dignity, and Kelsey also would be a great resource for this, because Kelsey was part of the hashtag Dignity Babes. But basically it's kind of this traditional concept. And like, I also come from a place of, hi, sorry, this is Mayo. he's my pug. He comes from this, it comes from this place of a traditional understanding. And so you can split Sect into like night charts or day charts. And then we also have to kind of explain that night charts basically, you know, day Sect or night Sect charts basically mean like, if your sun is above the horizon, so houses 1 through 6, you're a day chart. If it's below the horizon, if it's night chart is houses 1 through 6, if the sun's there, and then it's a day chart if it's through houses 7 through 12. And you have to also, you know, so your luminary of Sect would either be the moon if it's a night chart, or the sun if it's a day chart. And then you have to discuss kind of this idea of your in Sect malefics and you're out of Sect. And traditionally Jupiter and Saturn are the kind of greater planets. So Jupiter would be the greater malefic and Saturn is the, oh my God, I'm brain mush today. Saturn is the greater malefic, Jupiter is the greater benefic. And in a night chart, your your insect planets would be Mars and Venus. So Mars would be the malefic, and then Venus would be the benefic. And so like for some people, you know, kind of like I like to explain it as like, since I'm a night chart person, because Saturn is my out of sect malefic, Saturn is one of my harder planets. Like it's one of my most challenging planets to work with. But Venus being my insect benefic, Venus is like my most joyous planet, like the planet that I focus on for like the most creation and the most, you know, it provides me the best bounty when things are hitting that. So we have to talk about sect in a way, because, you know, for night charts, you kind of have to think about like, oh, Saturn might be really challenging for me to work with, and day charts might have an easier time because it's their insect malefic. Kelsey, if you want to speak to that too, and dignity, you totally can. I hope that I explained that well enough. I'm just brain mush right now.
Yeah. So to add on to Sect, just to think, especially if anyone's listening who's newer to astrology or new to Sect in general, a really simple practical application of this is, if you look at your natal chart, so I'm not talking about transits yet, but if you look at your natal chart and you have a day chart, because Mars is your out of sect malefic, you could, very generally speaking, look to your Mars placement by house and say that this is going to be one of the areas of life that is most challenging for you. And that isn't to say that you wouldn't also experience challenges where the other malefic, your insect malefic, Saturn is placed, but those might feel more like constructive or surmountable challenges. And then vice versa for people with a night chart, your Saturn placement is going to show you where you tend to experience the most frequent challenges of your life. Whereas your Mars placement, there might be that sort of like Martian heated energy there, but you experience it in a slightly more productive way. So, and it's not, I'm borrowing this language from Lisa Scheim, the like insurmountable challenges versus surmountable challenges. That's strong language. I wouldn't say that where you have your out of sect malefic is actually insurmountable, but they probably feel a lot more insurmountable than where you have your insect malefics. And then if you think by transit, I can just speak anecdotally to this experience I had where I was at one of the astrology meetups in Chicago back when I lived there and led the Inner Sense Healing Arts Collective meetups. We still do them virtually now, but in person. Drew Levanti came and did a talk on Sect, and one of the things he had us do was split up based on day charts and night charts. And we did a bunch of different things in these two groups, but the thing I recall most vividly is there was a discussion about Saturn return for the people in those groups who had experienced their Saturn return or were in their Saturn return. And I was in the night chart group, of course, and there were a couple people in my group who had Saturn in Scorpio, which is, they had very intense returns. And I would like glance away from this really intense emotional conversation we were having to the day group people, and they were all just like, la-di-da, like, oh yeah, this is when I learned that. This is when I figured this out. And I think the whole, this is when I figured this out is probably a common experience for people during their Saturn return, but it's like through agony or through just a quote, tough lesson, you know? So that can be something to consider too. A lot of times when I'm doing readings, people come and they're all freaked out about their upcoming Saturn return. And I have a lot of thoughts about that, and I'm sure we'll get to that. But half the time, literally half the time, I'm like, you got a day chart. It's cool, like chill out. It's not gonna be agonizing. That being said, all three of us here have night charts.
Yeah, but I do know, like, especially for the Saturn in Capricorn as a night chart for you, Kelsey, I'm sure, and we'll speak to it later, but I'm sure because like, and we'll talk about dignity too, but I know that Capricorn is, you know, Saturn's night ruler. So I know for like a lot of people that I've met who had Saturn in Capricorn and were night charts, they were like, well, you know what you're saying, Lisa saying like it's insurmountable. It might've been like a little easier for them, just because that's where Saturn is most, you know, Saturn is obviously like most comfortable, and you know, moving to dignity, essential dignity is also like a concept in traditional astrology where we talk about like this, you know, the quality and like condition of a planet, And so it really is like, you know, it could describe the strength or like, you know, the weaknesses. And so it's funny because Saturn also for the first, you know, two, like for Capricorn and Aquarius in traditional rulership, they're kind of in their home. Saturn's in their home there. So we have this idea of, you know, signs and domicile, which is kind of like the where they are natural. They don't have really any trouble that they feel at home. They have, you know, planets in fall, planets in, you know, detriment, and then there's like planets that are exalted. So like in Saturn, for Saturn, it is exalted in Libra. So I'm sure people with Saturn in Libra were having a fun time. And then there are planets, you know, that are in their fall. So it might feel like, Kelsey, you might have a better way to explain this, but, you know, planets in their fall just don't feel comfortable there. They just, it's literally like the opposite of the sign that, you know, they feel comfortable in. So it's kind of like being, it's kind of like, I like to use like Mars signs when I talk about essential dignity. And it's like, you know, Aries and Mars feels at home kind of like with the tools that it has, but like Libra Mars, it's trying to do a Mars, like a Martian action through a Libra lens. And sometimes that can be difficult because like Libra is ruled by Venus. It has these like tools that it's not used to. And then detriment is just, Kelsey, you should cover that because I'm like, detriment is just a whole other ballgame.
I'm curious, we didn't talk about this before we started. John, do you have a Hellenistic background?
My background is mostly modern astrology, but I do incorporate traditional astrology into my practice. And something that I had actually, I think something that helps me with sect and dignity is also thinking a lot about the rationale of it, which is that Saturn, you know, when they could only see up to Saturn, these are the visible planets. Saturn is the furthest away from the sun. So Saturn is a really, really cold planet. So the reason it does better in the daytime is that there's the heat of the sun that kind of mitigates that coldness a little bit. But then at night, it doesn't really have that help. And then, you know, the reason it's so comfortable in Capricorn and Aquarius is, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, these are like the coldest seasons of the year. This is winter. So it's like, oh, this time of year is cold, I'm cold. Like we get along really, really well. But then when you get to other planets like Aries, for instance, where it's in its fall and the sun is getting warmer, the days are getting longer. It's like, oh, no, we don't like this energy, this like impulsive self-assertion. Like, no, let's be responsible. Let's be austere. Let's be like cold and reserved.
Yeah, I think all of these systems like Sect and essential dignity, and if you go backwards a little bit in like astrological education systems, you can think about triplicities and quadruplicities, aka modes and elements. They're all really useful. And as an astrology teacher and as a person who thinks in a very Virgoan way, South Node in Virgo, it's really useful, I think, to have these things. But once you learn them, it's very important to do what John just modeled and understand the why of them, so that you can come to your own less fatalistic, less doomy, and like internalized intuitive understanding of them, and actually use them instead of fear them, for instance. So like with dignity, like one of the big things we talked about in the essential dignity, the hashtag dignity babes conversations, was nuance. And that, yes, these systems, these planet to sign pairings to help us understand the condition of a planet based on what sign it is in and its relationship to that sign is super useful. But it's not an end all be all, because there are still so many, first of all, there are still so many other factors within the natal chart, often referred to as accidental dignities, like all the other things that affect the condition of that planet. And then there's all the things that aren't in the natal chart, that are your life, that are your outlook, that are how you choose to work with the energy, all the support that you have that is not something that is maybe like super apparent to you in your natal chart. So, and I think this kind of ties into another thing I wanted to share about the concept of fearing transits in general too, is that everything is cyclical, and astrology is showing us where you are on a map of time, right? And so if your Saturn return just started in Aquarius, or if your Saturn return is starting in Pisces, nothing's gonna like come out of left field and start making your life suddenly worse than it was. Like, that's not really how it works. Some might say, except for when you're talking about a Uranus transit, I suppose. But in general, like, you're already working, like, now that I'm past my Saturn return and only by a month and 2 days, I can, and even near the end of my Saturn return, I was able to sort of look back and understand how my Saturn return was the next chapter after my Saturn in Sag, and how that was the next chapter after my Saturn in Scorpio. And so it's all building up, and it's not something that needs to be feared at all, because it's not like, it's something that was always going to happen, whether or not you knew about it astrologically.
Yeah, and I think that also speaks to, like, when we talk about the cycle of time, like I said, with the, you know, time is a really big thing for Saturn, with Cronus and restriction with time and thinking about it. And we also have to know, especially when we're talking about Saturn transits, every 7 years, Saturn enters a new sign. You're gonna have this restriction somehow in some way. So I'm like, Saturn returns shouldn't really be something that's feared, because you're constantly dealing with an aspect to your natal Saturn every 7 years. You know, there's this cycle of time. And I think that's also, you know, I think about the lifespan of a human, and I think about, you know, we have all these, there's a Saturn transit hitting us every 7 years. And, like, you know, it hits us when we're around 21. And so it's like, you know, that's a formative time for some people, right? You're most, you know, the kind of Western normative cycle of time is like 21, you're an adult, you can drink, right? In Western culture, and especially US culture, you're able to drink, you're dealing with these, you know, and that's, you're dealing with these like really important time periods, and you know, around 21, that's a Saturn square to your natal Saturn. And so, you know, we can see Saturn and transits in general, like squaring is seen as a hard aspect. And so you're dealing with how to kind of transition into this life of, you know, I personally think you're not really an adult until like your Saturn return, but you're dealing with this time of transition, and like dealing with this, you're learning how to transition into the world. And that's a Saturn thing. You can't be like a kid anymore. Like, you're not, Saturn is there with the square to kind of teach you and restrict you to be like, all right, you have to conduct yourself in a different way, right? And you have to learn how to deal with that energy. So yeah, talking about Saturn transits in the passage of time, I mean, I'm, like I said, just entering, it hasn't even hit directly to me yet, but I think it's conscious to think about that cycle of time, like Kelsey said, and to know that Saturn, you know, is changing through that cycle of time. And I think it's also important to, with Saturn transits, to kind of remind yourself, like, you know, it happens every 7 years. So like, think about important moments that have happened in your life and the ages that you're happening to, like around Saturn return. Sometimes that's like kind of like a quarter life crisis for people, right? So yeah, that's kind of how I feel about that cyclical passage of time. And we can talk about, you know, Saturn transits too.
Yeah, and I definitely think, you know, the benefit of astrology is not, I know this is coming, let me be afraid about it. The benefit is like sort of what you're both talking about with these cycles, is like, I know this thing is coming and it might be a little challenging, but I'm going to grow from it. And then there will be this other period that's less challenging after, and then maybe there will be a challenging period after that. And it's just knowing that, I think especially so much in Western society, we can fall into this like narrative of constant nonstop progress. And that's not how life works. And that's not how being a human works. And I think what I love about astrology is it's kind of like a reminder of that. And it can help us weather those seasons better, instead of feeling like, oh my God, everything's falling apart and it's never going to come back together. And speaking about these Saturn transits, I think this is as someone who is further away from his Saturn return, this is something that helps me, because I often think about, you know, the first Saturn, as you were saying, Christa, the first Saturn square happens when we're like 7, and the Saturn opposition happens when we're 14. And then the second Saturn square happens when we're 21, and then the Saturn return happens around 28, 29. But you can kind of think about, okay, what happened? I mean, kind of when you're like the 7 and 14, it's a little like, I was a kid, I didn't have all that much agency. But especially like you can think about what happened at 21 and be like, okay, what kind of themes was I working through, and how am I doing with those themes now, and how might they revisit me at my Saturn return?
Yeah, I'm thinking about how even in this conversation and like witnessing my own mental process and trying to figure out what is appropriate to say and what is not about Saturn. I'm finding like this code switching showing up in my brain where, because I'm on this call with you two astrologers and we're here for me, I'm here to reflect and share on my Saturn and Capricorn return. There's this part of me that wants to be like, oh my God, it was awful. And the part of me that is wanting to say that is the part of me that really benefited from knowing that I was experiencing this challenging transit when I was experiencing it, because that was really the medicine, was the ability to know this is temporary. And for me, it squares my Aries stellium as well. So like my 5th house Aries stellium, which is very much like my light that I like to shine, was being limited and restrained. And I could feel that like in my body and in my mind every day. So there's that piece. And I think John spoke to that really well. But I know like for me, if I hadn't discovered astrology, not even during my Saturn return, but during my Sati Sati, because I have a Sag moon. So I was actually, for me, that was much worse. And in Vedic astrology, they do consider the 7-year period where Saturn is in the sign before your moon, of your moon, and after your moon to be a more challenging Saturnian transit than the Saturn return. And speaking from my experience, that was absolutely the case. It was also angular for me, 1st house. So all of my context here is to say that no one's Saturn return is the same. No one's any transit is the same. So you need to like trust your own experience first. But anyway, so there's this like astrologer with their astrologer friends part of me that's like, thank God I knew it was my Saturn return, because I was depressed and I have started to feel it lift, and I expected it to lift after this. And it sucked. But then there's the astrologer, the practicing astrologer, and the astrology teacher that wants to be like, no, it doesn't suck. It's not going to be horrible. And in that way, I'm like, yeah, it didn't suck. Like I was fine. I had everything I needed. I learned a lot. Like it wasn't the end of the world by any means, but I think I would have been in a lot worse emotional shape during it had I not had the perspective of astrology to show me. So I really think that's like, for me, that's one of the healthiest uses of awareness of a transit from a malefic, is just, it's happening and you can find some peace in that. And I also just briefly wanted to clarify, because I think, Christa, you were talking about the hard aspects and the squares and the oppositions, and you said every 7 years Saturn goes into a sign. So just to clarify, in case people don't know, Saturn goes into a new sign every 2.5 to 3 years. So you're experiencing that Saturnian hard knock life lesson focus of your attention in a new part of your life every 2.5 to 3 years when Saturn shifts signs. But when Saturn hits a hard aspect to your Saturn, that's when you're experiencing like a turning point or a culmination point or a new point in your Saturn cycle specifically.
Sorry, y'all, I'm brain mush today, but yeah, what Kelsey said. And I think it's important to like also mention that as millennials, we only represent half of the millennial Saturn placement. So like the older millennials went through their Saturn return. My partner's a Saturn in Scorpio, and he personally, for him, he's a day chart. It didn't hit him that much, and it only hit him once. And then there was also Saturn in Sagittarius before all of us. So I wanted to mention that, the millennial Saturn placements are, Saturn in Scorpio, Saturn in Sagittarius, Saturn in Capricorn, Saturn Aquarius, and Pisces. It's great to have, the last three kind of like the people before. So Kelsey, you represent just ended. I'm going through it, slash I just, Saturn ingressed into Aquarius and this past December. And so I'm like, even though it hasn't hit me directly, I still feel it. And then John, you'll be going through yours, in a couple of years too. So I just wanted to kind of point that out, that, there's other Saturn people, there are other millennials that also had this transit, and I want to acknowledge them because they came before us. And so they also have insight.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Sorry. I was just going to throw into, I'm being very astrology teacher right now, but just in the event that there are people newer to astrology listening, which I imagine there are, because a lot of people are like, I need to know about this Saturn stuff. Saturn Return is very trendy. Just a couple like quick structural tips. I already lost one of them, but one of them that I wanted to share was, if you're trying to figure out when those hard aspects for Saturn for you are, look at the mode of your Saturn placement. So if you have a cardinal Saturn placement like I do, Saturn in Capricorn, then when Saturn was in the other cardinal signs, in my case, Aries, Cancer, and Libra, that's when I was experiencing a Saturn square, opposition, and then square again before the conjunction. So just an easy way to think about it. So if you have Saturn in a mutable sign, Gemini, Sag, and Pisces, and am I missing one?
Virgo.
Thank you. Those would be your hard aspects to your natal Saturn, and then fixed signs, Aquarius, Leo, Scorpio, Taurus.
And I also think it's pertinent to also note that because time is cyclical and we are going through it, that like the first Saturn return isn't your only Saturn return, hopefully, right? And then you're still going to have to take those lessons with you with your next Saturn square and your next Saturn opposition. So you're going to live with these lessons. It just, I think Saturn return kind of gets the big, oh my God, because it's the first time it's hitting again, when to your natal Saturn, it's sitting right on top of there and it's kind of looming, but it's you shouldn't really be afraid of it, and you're always going to be, every 7 years, for yourself working with kind of this Saturnian energy. And even when you're not in a hard aspect placement of Saturn, like for me, like Saturn in Capricorn, it's not my it's not hard aspected to any of my Saturn placements, but like for me, Saturn in Capricorn was like a really interesting and kind of formative time for me, because it was hitting in my like 6th house. You can still feel those Saturn restrictions of like, for my 6th house, I had to learn how to have a friggin' schedule. Like I had to learn how to be able to like enjoy the mundane, or at least like get my crap together when it came to this like day-to-day stuff. So it, Saturn makes himself known in those ways. And I just the more that I'm discuss Saturn and the more that I'm like living in this period of Saturnian my Saturnness, the more that I appreciate the lessons that Saturn teaches.
And to the point about millennials with this placement, I think it's also, first I want to clarify that like and typically when a lot of astrologers talk about the millennial generation, we're often talking about the Pluto and Scorpio generation. So if you want to look at a chart signature that it pretty much lines up with what everyone says millennials, but the years can be off a little bit at the beginning and end. But for the three of us, for those of us who have Saturn in Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces, we also all have Neptune and Uranus in Capricorn. So it's very, particularly for Kelsey's subgeneration with Saturn and Cap, it's very Cap heavy. But for all of us, it's like very Cap heavy. And there's an astrologer, Jessica Davidson, who wrote this article that I really took to, which talked about, because there's so many Cap placements and Saturn rules Capricorn, there can be a way in which it particularly is a time of maturation at our Saturn return, because those other Capricorn placements are also kind of maturing in a way, which I think is kind of can fit with a lot of the signatures of the millennial generation, where it can kind of, it because of economic circumstances, world circumstances, it can take us a bit longer to get going. But yeah, I think it's particularly was a reason why I wanted to bring us all together to share our experiences, because also we're at the end of the zodiac, and that's in a way the end of a Saturn cycle for like the world in general, of Saturn transiting through from Aries to Pisces, and one set of lessons and then ushering in a new set of lessons after that cycle's over.
Yeah, I've had a definite attitude throughout my Saturn return, throughout the Saturn transit through Capricorn. And as I think I became pretty aware that this earth, this society, specifically in America, that I'm inheriting, that my generation is inheriting, is fucked around like 1819. But there definitely was a component of the Saturn return that was like, well, let me reverse. I definitely had this sort of mood throughout my Saturn return that when me and my Saturn cohorts were finished with our return, what's that meme, like, it's over for you fools? That's kind of like the vibe that I've had throughout my return, is like, you world, you just wait, like wait until we've done this reckoning, until we have no more fucks left to give. Wait until we step into our power. Wait until, as you're saying, John, I love that point you made, our Uranus and our Neptunes and our Saturns have all reached this point of maturation. Like, just you fucking wait, we're coming. And I had that feeling as applied to my own Saturn cohort throughout my return. And now I'm looking at it and I'm also applying that to the millennial generation in general, and like really looking forward to having that same, that same sense of sort of like stepping into a role of ownership over your life, or your role in the world, or it's gonna show up, and your blank is gonna be very dependent on what your Saturn placement is. But in general, like stepping into a role of ownership, deconditioning and taking responsibility to create what it is you want out of your life or your world is definitely one way I've looked at the Saturn return period, as like when you make that rite of passage to take on that ownership, to take on that responsibility in it. And it gives me a lot of hope, even though we're in this point of like major instability and major reckoning on a societal level right now. I think that I know that that's connected to this cycle of the millennial generation being like, no more. And so we're what, are we halfway through? We're like 2/3 way through. We've only got 2 signs left out of how many Saturn signs?
Right. What's 2 12? 1/6 left. So 5/6 of the way. Well, I can't do math at all. 5/6 of the way there.
Yeah, and I like thinking about that as like, that's what this reckoning is right now, is like the Pluto and Scorps. We're not afraid to look at it. We've always felt that way. That's one way I think about the Pluto and Scorpio placement, is like, we'll take you to that spot. We'll go to those depths. We're not afraid of it. And then as we're going through our Saturn returns and all of those parts of our charts, as John mentioned, which is not just Saturn, all those different parts of our charts are going through this period of maturation where like, I'm not only not afraid to go there, but I'm also like willing to step up and make it what I want it to be, or make it what we want it to be. So that's like my Sagittarian optimistic view on like how the Saturn return process is like beautiful and necessary, because we need to fix this fucking world.
Kelsey, you're so Saturn daddy right now. Like, after that Saturn return, we can talk about our individual experiences. So Saturnian daddy. I just had to point that out. It's like the way you speak about it. I'm like, that's like my hope for like, after, and I can speak to this later, is like, once I'm done with my Saturn return, it's over for you hoes. Like, that's how I feel. And I'm like, I just want to embody Saturn daddy.
And I feel like this would be a great moment to transition to talking about our individual experiences. If you want to jump in first, Kelsey, and you just finished your Saturn return, and just share more about what that experience was like for you and how it was filtered through Saturn's house placement and all that.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, daddy, please teach us.
Yes, I'm just like loving that you just said that about me, Christa, because I identify so hard as a Jupiterian person. I have Sag rising, so Jupiter is my chart ruler. I have long sleeves on, so I can't show you, but I have a huge tattoo of Jupiter on my arm. I have a Sag moon, so Sag moon and rising, I'm just like very saggy, and I very much relate to bountiful, expansive, hopeful, optimistic, big picture, exciting Jupiter saggy energy. And I've thought, let me see if I can make this go full circle, because I have a complete thought that I'm just now coming to. I've thought about my Saturn return a lot, and I just spoke to this a little bit on a more collective level, but as a period of time where I am deconditioning in order to step into a sense of autonomy and authority over my life, and specifically the second house area of life, which I can speak to more in a moment. And I've like, one of the things that's happened is even my understanding of Saturn as a concept in astrology has become deconditioned throughout this process. As a byproduct of that, my understanding of the concept of responsibility has become deconditioned, and I've come to my own understanding of what it is to be responsible for myself and for my relationships and for my communities and for the world. And I think that metamorphosis happened throughout my Saturn return, partially as a result of me being like, am I doing my Saturn return wrong? Because I have Saturn in the second house, and it was during my Saturn return, or just slightly before my Saturn return, that I quit my full-time high school teaching job. I used to be a high school choir director. That I started that job during my waning Saturn square. So something interesting around the chapters and the storyline, the story arc there. And then it was during my Saturn return that I quit teaching again, because after I quit teaching, I took on a part-time teaching job and like started working for myself and started building Inner Sense, the nonprofit that I co-founded. So it was during my Saturn return that I said for sure goodbye to teaching. On both occasions when I quit teaching, I didn't really know what was next. I used to save money when I was a teacher. I don't save money now. So like very conventional, irresponsible choices that I made. And so there were many periods during my Saturn return, and specific to money, because the second house is about money amongst other things, financial security, material security, what you have, what you value, your sense of worth. The way that I usually describe the second house in a teaching setting is like, the first house is you, your body, like your actual vessel. And then the second house is one layer outside of that. It's not actually you, but it's the things that you identify with and you project yourself onto that you have. So you kind of make them a part of your identity, a part of your worth. But so I made all these conventionally irresponsible decisions about money while I was experiencing my Saturn return in the second house. And I had so much insecurity and doubt about that. I was like, oh my God, I'm doing it wrong. I'm doing it wrong. And it took many conversations with different astrologers. I have one memory specifically in mind of being at NORWAC 2019 and being out for Thai food with a group of astrologers, and Erin Shipley, Sabrina Monarch, and Cameron Allen, and Cam's of my Saturn cohort, but I think Erin and Sabrina are both Aquarius. They started this reframe for me around Saturn that I liked and then forgot and then eventually came back around to. But oh my gosh, I'm talking so much. But essentially what happened was I realized probably pretty close to the end of my Saturn return, like definitely in the second half of it, that I was just thinking in a really limited way about the concept of responsibility. And I was thinking about responsibility and how it had been passed on to me through familial structures, as well as just societally. And so it was conditioning essentially. And so my Saturn return, through like, who knows how much of it was because I was thinking consciously about the concept of responsibility because of I knew I was in my Saturn return versus whatever else, I couldn't tell you. But I definitely went through this process of realizing that part of my work during my Saturn return was to take a step out of what I had been taught was responsible and determine for myself what is responsibility, and then operate and make life choices according to my values, the second house as well. But anyways, what I was trying to get back to is that when Christa, when you said I was being so Saturn daddy right now, it was interesting to hear you say that, because I thought I was operating out of this like Jupiterian place of like, we're going to fix it, we're going to make it better. But in seeing you observe it that way, it helps me realize that I think even well, of course, my Jupiterian nature got its sort of Saturn maturation. And I went from being like, the world can't be this bad. It just can't be. It's got to be better than this. And it feels like a part of my process of the Saturn return was like, but it is, and it can be better, but this is where it is. And this is what it will take, at least like in my personal sphere, in my second house experiences, this is what it will take in order to face it. So I like my Saturn return, speaking more practically about what actually happened. I built a business. I built Inner Sense Healing Arts Collective. I went to astrology school, Portland School of Astrology, where Christa is now. With Inner Sense, we opened a space, which we closed for COVID, but it's just this continually expanding healing arts business. I finished my yoga teacher training, I think towards the beginning of my Saturn return. And then once Inner Sense was open, I was also like becoming a little more sophisticated in my astrology practice. I finished a Reiki training. So these are all like resources that I gathered during my Saturn return, and immediately started offering, because I had the blessing and the privilege of having just built this healing arts nonprofit, where I immediately had a space that I could teach yoga as a brand new teacher, that I could teach astrology as a brand new teacher, which is like, I don't think a lot of people get to do that. I could teach Reiki as a brand new teacher. And then I had an audience through Inner Sense. So I was able to start my astrology practice like right away. So this all feels like a big part of my Saturn return. I also did a lot of just deconditioning around money that I still feel like I'm very much in the process of, but I do feel like there were some notable releases of conditioned money thinking and conditioned like lack mindset near the end of my Saturn return as well. And then I just wanted to add to one way that I thought about Saturn kind of from the beginning that might be useful is Saturn is trying to teach us excellency. Saturn is trying to help us master something. And we have the opportunity through our Saturn placement and through Saturn transits to really like nose to the, I never get phrases right. Nose to the grindstone, is that a thing? You know what I'm trying to say, if that's not the thing. We have the opportunity to like really get down and dirty and do the work that has the potential for us, that offers us potential for reaching a level of mastery over a long period of time, because Saturn rules patience and Saturn rules long periods of time. So like, I think at some point I will have established a really solid relationship to money and earnings and all of that. And I'm not there. I would not say the Saturn return is like, if you do the work, you're done. But I have a clearer picture now of what that might look like and how I might get there, which will look very different than at least up until this point in time, what society had taught me the second house functioned like in terms of like earning money and all of that. And I also just want to add one more little note. I had my first human design reading last week with a human design analyst and astrologer named John Cole, and he referenced Saturn in a way I hadn't heard before that I really liked, which was that Saturn by transit makes it harder to compromise. And I really liked that way of thinking about it. Like when Saturn is transiting a planet in your chart or a house in your chart, Saturn just makes it so that you can't compromise there anymore. You have to face what is and deal with it. And through that, facing the limitation or facing what is, there's this opportunity to, I wouldn't say like grow beyond it, but grow with it, to grow like within it and through it.
Speaking to what you just said, and I think it's a good transition point into kind of how I feel about my Saturn return, the whole responsibility thing. I think where Saturn in Cap it was, I mean, for you, you said you were learning how to be responsible. And I think for my generation, or like my cohort of Saturn in Aquarius, I think I guess cohort-ish, our focus is really like our responsibility to each other, our responsibility to our higher systems and like our greater ecosystem. And, you know, we saw that, I think, especially when Saturn entered Aquarius for that first pass last spring, you could definitely tell with all the riot, you know, all the like, you know, not riots, but like all the protests happening, and like, you know, people were finally gathering with their communities to be able to call out all of these like structures that have been horribly broken. And I also think that speaks to like Pluto Scorpio things, and, you know, America, we're all living in America, so it's coming from this lens of like America's going through their Pluto return, or about to, right? And I think the Saturn in Aquarius definitely was the beginning of like, it's like, was very much, you know, what is the responsibility of us as individuals to this greater like community that we have, and how are we able to kind of like tear shit down to be able to rebuild it again. And that's what I really loved about what you said about responsibility, and also this like not compromising. It came out in full force last spring and into summer with that Saturn in Aquarius. It was very strong, where like we really wanted to like not even just working and growing with it, but we were definitely like, let's tear this, like let's expose it for what it is, and then find out ways that we can get together to be able to work with it, and also like to fight the injustice that is happening. And I like to always say like the only way out is through. And with the, you know, the whole, the way that you were saying like your human design, I guess like person.
I call them analysts in human design. Human design
analysts said, where it doesn't compromise. I'm like, well, why should we? These things are obviously in like a bad place, and you know, I think the only way out is usually through. And I think Saturn has definitely like, or is teaching me that like the only way out of hard times is through them. And Saturn definitely is like, you have to face it, like you can't ignore these things anymore. And I think for this time too is like, with, as we see like politics shift and like the world, like the more, I guess like the kind of division between us, like there are people like older generations are very much like, let's unify. And Saturn and Aqua and like my cohort is very like, no, I'm going to point these things out to you, because the way things were working, it obviously hasn't benefited the greater structure and like the greater community. So we're going to tell you from our perspective how this has been working, and how we can change it in a way that you probably haven't thought about, because you're coming from this like lens and you're so far removed from it that, you know, you have wisdom and age, but I'm like, it doesn't work for the structures that fit today.
Yeah, and I think one way to think about the Saturn shift from Capricorn into Aquarius too, and we can think about this collectively, you can also look at it in your own natal chart and see the house topics from one to the other. But Saturn and Cap's Earth, so in Saturn is reckoning, right? So Saturn and Cap is like reckoning with what is on the material plane, like what systems, what institutions, what I think about Capricorn a lot is having to do with like the societal agreements, the societal contracts that we've made. Because I think of the Cap Cancer axis as like a container, and Capricorn specifically is the container for the agreements we've made about how we will structure society and live on this shared planet together. And so Saturn and Cap was like, we're reckoning with what is, we're reckoning with our quote democracy, we're reckoning with the institutions, with the policies, all the things. And then Saturn in Aquarius is an air sign, so it doesn't have to do with what is, it has to do with intellectualizing. So it's like Saturn in Aquarius is like what could be. So during Saturn and Capricorn, we were like, here's what is, and now we're shifting into this period of like, but here's what could be. But it's still this reckoning process. It's not like Jupiter in Pisces, what could be, right? That's coming for a little bit this year, and I look forward to it. But Saturn in Aquarius is like what could be, and it's fixed, and it's committed, and it's strong, and it's revolutionary. So it's like, I don't know, still thought in process right now for me, but it's very much like, it's still a reckoning, but it's a more imaginative reckoning.
I think of it as like, it's kind of, there is a reckoning coming, right? But I think with the Saturn and Aquarius cohort and group, it's more of this like, how do we intellectualize and getting together to be able to like eventually, you know, bring out these ideas. And I should also mention that, you know, the internet is a Saturn and Aquarius. And so it was a way for us to connect. And, you know, personally for me in my Saturn and Aquarius, and I haven't had it hit direct for me yet, and I go through a triple pass. So gonna be fun for me. And it's in my 7th house. So I've, you know, the first pass around for Saturn and Aquarius for me was very much focused on like structures and how I am attached to people and how I am, you know, how I deal with learning, because I went through like a huge like kind of, you know, especially with the pandemic that hit, that's hitting us right now. It made me really evaluate what I wanted to keep. And like I said, Saturn, you know, Saturn in mythology, like literally cut off his dad's balls. So I'm like, yeah, for me, Saturn was a lot of severing, and Saturn was a lot of, Saturn Aquarius that first hit was a lot of, how can I kind of improve myself and improve what my relationship to others. And also Saturn, for a lot of people or most of my cohort, it's opposite Chiron. It's opposing Chiron. And for me, it's since it's in the 7th house, it's also opposing my ascendant. And so for me, it really is this reckoning of like, how do I improve myself, and how do my relationships that I have with others reflect on like my sense of self? So it, you know, for me, it's very twofold. So for me in the beginning, I would say like it was the first pass, it was very much this like, how do I build with my community? What are ways that I can get organized? And it was very like all up in the air, all thinking, all very like more so organizing than actually taking action, right? And now that, you know, Saturn it finally is going through its full pass through in Aquarius, it really has helped me kind of figure out a way to like build my community, build those relationships around others. Like I run a Saturn and Aquarius support group over the internet, right? Like that's a very Saturn and Aquarius thing to do, try to build connection in ways that, you know, we're not used to, and we're trying to adapt to the world right now. And, you know, I've got a couple questions on Instagram about like Saturn and Aqua placements. I kind of went over that, but like, I think for career and for Saturn, I also got like, what careers should people in Saturn and Aquarius do? And I would venture to guess that this person is either having Saturn transiting their 6th or their 10th house, right? Probably their 10th, sitting maybe on their midheaven. And so for me, it's like, there is no usual career for Saturn and Aquarius, is because it is so revolutionary, and there's so many different ways for it to manifest. But I think in terms of like the generational cohort, like you could be doing organizing, you could be, you know, it's up to your interest, but it's like, you could be doing organizing, or you could be like an advocate for someone, or for, you know, I think for my very much like Saturnian remediation, it's very much been like learning how to do the work for myself. So I've been going to therapy pretty much constantly to be able to work on, like, I go to interpersonal therapy. And that has really helped me improve my relationships with like others. And like, there's sort of also this acceptance that I, you know, that I have to deal with, of like, sometimes people, you know, sometimes people don't react, and there's that compromise thing, right? Like I'm a Libra sun, like I always want compromise. I always want to make sure like I'm people pleasing. But Saturn in Aquarius for me has kind of been like, no, sometimes you don't need to compromise, and sometimes you need to have hard boundaries. And I think that's been very challenging for me over the years to accept. And it's also taught me that like, I just have to accept that like what other people, I can't control other people's behavior. I can't control what they do, but I can control my reaction. And if they aren't gonna be willing to like work on it with me, then I have the full, you know, I have the autonomy, and I have the agency to cut them off if I need to, because I need to protect myself and the sense of self through those relationships. So yeah, that's kind of how Saturn in Aquarius has been for me.
I'm curious, and I'd love to hear this from John too, since you're either at the beginning of your return or return hasn't started yet, just like speaking more generally about your Saturn placement. If Christa, for now, if like you could speak to when you started studying your chart a little more and started tuning into your Saturn in Aquarius, and maybe specifically in the 7th house, and like what that process of discovery was for you, and how you've seen Saturn as your out of sect malefic in your 7th house, in like how even before you knew that it was there, how you've experienced 7th house topics in your life, and then how knowing that in your chart impacted that experience. Does that question make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think also like when like I said, I got into astrology pretty more seriously within like, I would say like I first saw my chart around my 2nd Saturn square. And so like I kind of knew about the Saturn return, and like I was actually always afraid of it. So I'm like, I'm sure people have related to that. And I kind of, especially around my 2nd Saturn square, I actually didn't know it was in my house of relationships. I just kind of like, I also used Placidus then, so it probably was a little different too. But I use whole sign houses now anyway. My relationships and the way I dealt with a really hard time around the 2nd Saturn square with like my relationships. And I had always kind of like a generational thing too. Like my mom, I saw my mom have to choose between like work and love. And I thought that was going to be my thing. And I was like, oh, it's going to be like work and love. I have to choose between work and love for my Saturn return. That I always had kind of that like gut feeling in my heart that was what I was going to have to deal with. But the more that I got involved, and when I actually learned about my chart and like seeing the Saturn in Aquarius, kind of, especially what personal to me in the 7th house, there has always been that tied to sense of self and identity because of where it is and opposing things. And the more that I'm getting through it and dealing with it, the more that I'm actually seeing the nuances, I guess. It doesn't always have to be one or the other. I think I saw like a Saturn return as like very binary for some reason. Like it's either I'm going to suffer through it and I'm going to have to deal with this very hard time, but maybe that's because my 2nd Saturn square was like very challenging for me. But there's more nuance to it. And I don't know about you having, just been through it and giving, maybe you can speak to it as advice wise, but man, I just lost my train of thought. But it was like, I think it's like when you ignore things, they get harder. When you ignore things, they get harder. And so when you ignore your Saturn return, that's when people find it more challenging. But when you're like open and receptive to like the energy, because it's there. And the more you avoid it, the harder it gets. And I don't know if that was your like experience with it, Kelsey, or if you've heard from anyone in that sense. But I think for me, it's like, because especially because it's my out of sect malefic, but it's also in pure form my most dignified planet. Like it's my most dignified planet. It's like, it's the strongest planet in my chart because it's it's dignified. It's like in the place it wants to be, especially because it's, day Saturn. It hasn't been as challenging for me as I thought it would. It wasn't like the kind of like catastrophic, blow up my life. Like, maybe Uranus might've been. It's not blowing up my life. It's more subtle. And I think it's, because I'm in the beginning, I kind of feel the shift, but, it remains to be seen, and I'm still working on it, and I'm doing the work even though it hasn't hit directly. I hope that answered.
And then similar, obviously I'm the furthest away from my Saturn return, so it feels a little silly to talk about Saturn in Pisces when I know that like I've just scratched the surface of my Saturn placement, but my Saturn is pretty much on my ascendant. It's 3 degrees away from my rising sign. So Saturn is a very, very personal planet to me. It's very much associated with my sense of self. And Saturn in Pisces, I think in general is a complex combination because, I mean, we've talked about Saturn in Capricorn and Saturn in Aquarius, which are both signs that Saturn rules, but Pisces, you know, Pisces in traditional astrology is ruled by Jupiter, which has a very different energy from Saturn. And Pisces is kind of this boundaryless, like watery expanse of empathy, and sort of the division between this plane and the spiritual plane is kind of erased. The division between yourself and others is kind of erased. But Saturn is something that so much wants to place like limitations and restrictions and boundaries. So inherently there's this kind of paradox, but I think that's also, you know, paradox is a very Pisces thing. So I think that in the Saturn, you know, that's maybe why Saturn, in part why Pisces, even though it's an awkward Saturn placement, it's not the fall, it's not the detriment. And it is right there at the end of the zodiac, which I think, you know, if Saturn in Capricorn kind of unveils the systems and it shows us what's wrong with the systems, and it's like, look at all this shit. And Saturn in Aquarius is kind of like, look at all the things that we can do to fix it. I think Saturn in Pisces is in some sense about what we have to leave behind, because Pisces can be about escapism, and I think escapism is kind of gets a bad rep. I think there's bad ways to escape, but escapism, you know, if you're in a broken system and if you're in something that's not working, escape could be the right solution. And I think that's so much, you know, part of Saturn in Pisces is learning how to have boundaries, and it's certainly been that way for me, where I think particularly before my Saturn square, I thought that I kind of had to be, you know, with the Pisces rising, with the Pisces moon, I was like, the answer to life is just to be like really selfless and of service to people and to just give until there's nothing left. And my Saturn square when I was 21 was really challenging. I had not come out yet as a gay man, and I was kind of in denial about my sexuality, and I had like fallen in love with someone, and it was not a healthy relationship. But it was a relationship that was kind of a vehicle towards my coming out of, you know, it's a very first house thing where it's I had this relationship with someone else, but it was a vehicle towards understanding myself, where he was not able to come out, and I was kind of like, well, this is not what I want my life to be, so I kind of have to, you know, reinvent myself in this way and accept this truth about myself. And for me, there's a very like clear distinction between where it's almost like the person I was before the Saturn square and the person I am after feel like two different people. So in that sense, I'm kind of like excited about the Saturn return because I like change, and I'm excited to see like the next level of reinvention. But I do think that, you know, there's something in the Saturn myth that actually struck me when I was reading it today, which was that Uranus, which was Cronus's father, is the sky. And so when Cronus castrates Uranus, he's castrating the sky. And there's something about Pisces that is kind of like heavenly and like nirvana and the next plane and the next level of experience. And it's like, I think part of Saturn in Pisces is sort of learning how to hold both, is like, how do we castrate heaven while still holding like the possibility of it? And by that, I guess what I mean is that, you know, we're in the material world and we have to be in the material world. But actually, Kelsey, what you were saying about your perspective on money changing during your Saturn return, I think really resonated for me, because I think with Saturn in Pisces, particularly with Saturn on my ascendant, there can be this sense of responsibility and like, I'm supposed to do things a certain way, or I'm supposed to fulfill certain obligations. But with Pisces, those obligations are strangely towards a kind of spirituality, or towards a kind of creativity, a kind of transcendence, a kind of escapism. And what's been important for me is learning to trust that and like trust my own intuition in that, instead of feeling like I have to fit into society's definition of what it means to be a responsible human being. That what if the thing I have to be responsible for is something that isn't as tangible?
Yeah, that's just really beautiful, and I'm really appreciative to get to hear from a Saturn and Pisces native about your experience with it so far, and about just your sort of gut feelings about what that placement is for you. I think you can probably speak to what that placement will be like for the collective a lot more clearly than you know. I think for that, even as someone who's post Saturn return, I can't even imagine Saturn and Pisces for the reasons that you stated. It's like such a juxtaposition. Like, I cannot intellectually comprehend it all. And I'm really looking forward to it so that I can see what it is. And I think that's an interesting thing about Saturn and Saturn ruling like maturation and long-term lessons. Just thinking about how, like, as an astrologer, we can conceptualize things and we can understand the symbolism of things. And to a certain extent, and to varying certain extents, we can all sort of intuit, like in what's the verbiage of intuition? We can intuit what a transit might be or what a placement might feel like. But a really beautiful thing about like growing in your astrology practice is that you actually get to experience so many of the transits. And I really love everything you just spoke to about Saturn and Pisces, and I look forward to it. I was also noticing that you were talking about your second Saturn square as having been a really difficult time and not having come out yet and having to like reckon with identity, and that was on your MC, you know, so you can see that really clearly in your chart. And it made me think about one way that I use Saturn a lot that maybe will be useful for listeners is when I do a chart reading, I'm always paying attention to where Saturn is in the chart from a very holistic perspective, like where in the circle is Saturn right now. And maybe part of this for me might be because again, when I discovered astrology, Saturn was like 12th house for me. So this shift from moving into the top half of the chart into the bottom was like so clearly felt, and I saw it happening, that I just really, and it's just become one of the like staples that always resonates with people. Like, am I paying attention right now? Where on this arc of like external focus or internal focus am I right now? And one way I talk about that shift from 12 into 1 is like you just spent 14 years sort of examining your life outside of yourself and how you appear in the public world and how you conceive of the external world and the world at large. And then when Saturn hits your ascendant and goes down into the bottom half of your chart, you're taking all of that and you're bringing it down for this 14-year-long underworld process to restructure according to that. And so it's just really interesting hearing you speak of your square as like that culmination point of being focused externally. And you said you feel like a different person now. And it's like you're on this like downward peak from that culmination point, and you're preparing during your Saturn return is when you're going to like really take all of that in and embody the change and begin that like underworld process of restructuring.
That's beautiful, Kelsey. And I think that also speaks to, you know, we talked about time cycles, and that speaks to addressing a question that someone had with like, I think when we talk about like going through after your Saturn return, like what lessons do you take with you? How do you hold that? And I think it's a constant process based off what you said. I think there is, you know, it's not like what you said, it's not like one and done, you know what I mean? You're gonna go through another Saturn return, hopefully, and there's still these lessons and themes. And so what I thought you said really resonated with me. It's like beautiful that we have this, you know, for me, it was, you know, the second Saturn return was right on my IC. So it's like this feeling of home really is at odds with this feeling of my relationships and how I relate to people. And now I'm back to this like outer focus. And so like, what can I take with me through that from that 14-year cycle that will inform me now as I go through my Saturn return and I deal with, especially with this Saturn in Aquarius, how do I deal with that in the next 14-year cycle, in obligation to my community? Because that's, you know, Saturn in Aquarius kind of the cohort is like this responsibility to not only to ourselves, but to others. And I think of, you know, the good place and their big question of like, you know, what do we owe to each other? What is owed to us and each other? And so that's, you know, I really resonated with what you said, Kelsey. So I'm processing.
Yeah, and I really liked the way that John phrased it earlier too, when John, you were mentioning specifically the millennial signature of Neptune and Uranus in Cap, and how Saturn's doing this beginning, words are getting hard at the end here. Saturn is implementing this maturation process wherever it goes. And there's something that is very visual about that to me. that is definitely going to stick with me and sort of add some nuance to this practice I already have of being like, where in this circle of the zodiac are you? Because it's not just Saturn to your natal Saturn, right? It's also Saturn to your natal everything, and then Saturn to the houses and which part of your life this is activating. And so I just really like that. I guess you didn't quite serve it as a visualization, but it came through as a visualization to me, John, of like Saturn moving through and being like, you get a little more maturation, you get a little more maturation everywhere that it goes. And I really like that. It's really helpful.
I think the thing that is sticking out to me the most about the conversation is that, you know, we're sort of talking, we're orbiting a lot around the don't be so afraid of your Saturn return. And I think so much of what's sticking out to me is astrology can like prepare us for our Saturn return to an extent, but what we've all expressed is that our experience with our Saturn is so unprecedented to what we would have predicted it to be. And I think that is part of Saturn, in that, you know, it's about finding your own authority in the world instead of what you've inherited from other people and kind of your own knowledge. And no one else can give that to you. Like an astrologer can tell you what time that might happen and what area of your life it might happen in, but the lesson is going to be entirely singularly your own.
I love that.
Amen. Amen to that.
So on that note, with us wrapping up, I would love for people to have more information about where they can find out more about your work and what offerings you both have right now. Kelsey, if you want to go first.
Sure, yes. So you can find me at www.kelseyrosetort.com, KelseyRosetort.com. I'm at Kelsey Rose Tort on Instagram, and I'm at Astro Kelsey on Twitter. I, as I mentioned, am co-founder and co-director of Inner Sense Healing Arts, innersensehealingarts.org, at Inner Sense Healing Arts. We're a nonprofit that does lots of different spiritual programming, yoga, astrology, energy work, tarot, group processing, all sorts of cool stuff, lucid dream classes. We have classes every single day of the week, ongoing, regular, weekly and monthly classes, plus special workshops and longer term courses that we offer. And that's my main offering coming up, is starting March 9th. I'll be doing my third round of a Intro to Natal Astrology course, formerly known as Astrology in You, now known as Astrology for Yourself, which really speaks to what John so beautifully summed up at the end of our convo just now. I feel really drawn in my astrology practice to helping people understand why I'm saying what I'm saying, so that they know what pieces of it they want to take and continue to learn and check their own intuition and their own life experience around, and just use the astrology as a resource to help affirm what you already know, which is really what I use astrology for, to affirm what you already know on like a deeper level that is beyond conditioning. So that class starts March 9th. You can find info about it on my website. And then I also have a workshop coming up on February 7th called 360 Degrees of Sky, Understanding the Houses in Astrology. I think the houses are like one of the basic pieces that people struggle to get. And it was actually during my time at Portland School of Astrology with JP, who's one of Christa's teachers now, that I like really felt like I got the houses, and I have felt compelled to share what I know about them, because I think they're much easier actually to understand than they're often presented. So that's that.
Thanks, Kelsey. And I just want to say, like, I had the great time with you both. Kelsey, I've taken classes with you, so I can speak to you being a wonderful resource. So yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for being our elder here in the group. So I am at Christa Lei Says on Twitter. I kind of just troll on there though, so sorry. My website is christalei.me. My consultations are usually always open on a rolling basis within 90 days. And I do, you know, I love to hold space for people, and I have a Saturn Return special reading for those who are going through it and need guidance as like a peer support kind of thing. You can find me at supchrista on Instagram. I also have a Saturn Return and Aquarius support group. We meet quarterly on Saturdays because it's Saturn's day. And our next meeting is on February 13th. And so you can go to my website to find out about that. And that would be CHRISTALEI.me. And yeah, and I also am running, have some guest appearances. So I was on One Winged Chris Lamb's YouTube. We're doing a little mini series about like kind of like video games and anime and like astrology. And so that's been a fun project. And then my friend Stevie from What's Your Sign and I are doing a little mini series and kind of testing out kind of things. I don't know if this will come out at the time, but you can check it out on Instagram Live at spaghetti_witch or mine at supchrista. And we're doing Astro Trash, where we kind of just talk about pop culture through like a trashy lens and using astrology. And our first episode will be on Army Hammer and trigger warning stuff, but hopefully we can take it from there. And it's been super fun. And I really loved being soaked up in both your wisdom.
Yeah, same. I just want to say thanks too. Sorry to interrupt again. Yeah, thanks Christa for thinking of me, and thank you John for organizing this. It was like a real treat to be able to process what I thought the Saturn return was. I don't think I've like done this much processing on it since, so it was nice to share and to have things reflected back and share in your wisdom as well.
And thank you both for joining. I'm super excited to hear both of your experiences. For me, the best way you can get in contact with me is via my Instagram, which is johnpattersonofficial. If you don't have Instagram, you can reach me by email at john2patterson6@gmail.com. The 2 and the 6 are the numbers. Don't write them out. And then I am currently offering readings. I mostly do birth chart readings and annual predictions. So if you want to set something up, you can reach out to me and we can make that work. But again, thank you so much, Kelsey and Christa, for joining me and for sharing your wisdom and sharing your experience. I feel like I have, part of what I wanted to do with this is demystify Saturn a little bit, because it is something people are so afraid of. And I feel like, and it was also kind of selfish, where it's like, my Saturn return is in 3 years. What can I expect? Which I don't think we answered the question of what anyone can expect, but I think we offered something that was much more honest to the experience of Saturn. And I'm really grateful to both of you.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed hearing your insight, and it was so wonderful for you to think of me and with Kelsey too, for organizing this all.
Yes, more thanks, more love.
More gratitude also to listeners too. Thanks for listening in.